Welcome to Information Return Intelligence, where we keep you updated on all things 1099 and 1042S related. My name is Jason Dinesen, and let's just get started right away. So, today we want to talk about tips and overtime pay because the IRS recently published transitional guidance for reporting of tips and overtime in 2025. And while we usually think of this as a W-2 topic, and it also may have some relevance to you if you pay tips to independent contractors. And in fact, the IRS has released draft versions of the 2026 1099 NEC and 1099 miscellaneous that have new boxes on them for reporting both tips and overtime. We'll talk more about this as we go. Overtime in particular would be pretty rare to be reported on a 1099. Tips could be, though. So let's give you some background on this. We had earlier this year the One Big Beautiful Bill, which was signed into law on the 4th of July. And it created a new deduction for individual filers. So people, when they file their Form 1040, can take a deduction for qualifying overtime pay and tips that they received. Now, not all overtime or tips will qualify for the deduction, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Reporting of qualifying tips and overtime is required of employers. But the IRS released this notice called Notice 2025-62, which says that for 2025, they encourage employers to separately state qualifying tips and overtime, but are not going to assess penalties relating to this. Now, in 2026, the forms like the W-2 and 1099s are going to be updated to have boxes on them, or on the W-2 codes that you put in box 12 to show overtime and tips, but none of the payroll forms or 1099s are being updated for 2025. Now, draft versions of 2026 forms have been released by the IRS. And of interest to us on this podcast are the draft versions of the 1099 NEC and 1099 miscellaneous. Most of you watching this are probably filers of 1099s. You might file W-2s as well. And we have had some requests from people to expand into W-2 and payroll employee discussions as well. And maybe we will at some point down the road. But most of our discussion is on 1099s. And the main takeaway here is if you pay tips to a contractor that are qualifying tips, you need to report those starting in 2026 on the 1099 NEC. Now, the miscellaneous also has boxes relating to tips. I have a hard time thinking of too many situations where you would be using 1099 miscellaneous to report tips, though. I think that that would be a rare situation to use the miscellaneous. Now, what are qualifying tips? This is something we could spend a great deal of time about, but here's some basic framework. Tips must be paid in an industry where tipping is customary. That's one thing. The Treasury Department released a list of such industries in proposed regulations a couple of months ago. And on the form, there's a box for your industry code to show that you're a qualifying industry. Then the tips must be voluntary by the customer. And I like to give these two examples of what that really means. The first example is you go out to dinner, say with your significant other, and it's just the two of you, and you decide to leave a 20% tip. That's a qualifying tip because it's voluntary. So your server will be able to deduct that tip on their personal tax return. Example two is, let's say your company hosts an office party at a local restaurant and say 50 people attend, and the restaurant automatically adds an 18% gratuity charge to the bills of large parties. That is not eligible for the tip deduction because that's not a voluntary tip. And so, as the issuer of W 2s or 1099s where tips are involved, you will need to keep track of, is this a qualifying tip or is it not? Because you're going to need to break out qualifying tips so that the recipient knows how much they might be able to deduct on their tax return. Now, there's more to the tip deduction than this. There's some income limitations on personal tax returns on who can take the deduction, and some filing status limitations and so forth, but that's a basic framework. Most of the time, when we talk about the tip deduction, we're going to be talking about W 2 employees, but this could also arise in the context of contractors. And as we said before, the NEC and miscellaneous have both been redesigned for 2026 to include a box for qualifying tips as well as your industry code. Now, what about overtime? Qualifying overtime for this deduction on employee tax returns is overtime paid under Section 7 of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. What is that? That's the requirement that employees must get time and a half on hours worked in a week beyond 40. And that portion of pay may be deductible by employees. The 1099 NEC and miscellaneous drafts for 2026 both include boxes for qualifying overtime pay. I'm having a hard time thinking of any circumstance where someone receiving a 1099 would have overtime pay that actually qualifies for this deduction. The Fair Labor Standards Act applies to employees, not contractors. Now, a contractor could get overtime, but that would be something that would be negotiated in a contract, not a part of Section 7 of the Fair Labor Standards Act, so it wouldn't qualify. I don't think that it would qualify very often at all. So here's the bottom line on this. From your side, if you're the issuer of W-2s or 1099s, nothing special happens as far as processing the payment. Everything just runs through payroll like it always does if it's a W-2 employee, or you'll just pay your contractor like usual. However, behind the scenes, you will need to track what is a qualifying tip or what is qualifying overtime pay. The actual deduction happens on the employee's personal tax return at tax time if they meet other qualifications. So that'll do it for this episode of Information Return Intelligence. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Jason Dinesen. If you like this episode, make sure to subscribe and like and all that, and share this episode with your colleagues if you think they would be interested. Thanks so much, and catch us again next week.